Hello and welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow. It's a privilege to be inviting you along on this journey as we continue in our 10th edition to shape India's entrepreneurs, handhold them, and provide you with everything that you need in your growth journey. Tonight, as part of our high impact launch, we're going to be focusing on the macroeconomy. What should the government be doing when it comes to kickstarting growth? What perhaps should they be doing as part of their budget announcement and initiatives? What should you, the entrepreneur, be watching for when it comes to some of the macroeconomic cues, particularly given that we're in the middle of the third wave? All of that being discussed tonight as I pick the brains of one of India's foremost economists. It's my pleasure to welcome on the show for the first time Dr. Arvind Virmani. He is the former CA to the Government of India. He's also chairman, EGROW Foundation. Dr. Virmani, thank you very much for taking the time to join us here on this launch week and this high impact launch week that we're doing of season 10 of the Leaders of Tomorrow. Very happy new year to you, sir, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. Same to you.
Before we, talk about some of the macroeconomic indicators which are likely to have an impact on the life of India's small businesses and therefore your advice for them about what perhaps the rest of the year should be looking like, I want to start with your outlook for 2022. The new fiscal is not very far away. The budget is coming up. Things are changing as we speak, of course, because of the third wave. But sitting where we are with the information that we have, would you want to start off with an outlook that you have for 2022?
Let me very quickly give a little background. Since the start of the wave, we have actively done a lot of research at EGROW Foundation, which we had set up about 3 years ago. And so one of the key elements of that was we looked very carefully at the pandemic, the issue of epidemics, and then from there took off and worked out its implications. Why is that important? Because most people started from a comparison with the global financial crisis.
Sure.
And what our study showed was that the pandemic is very, very different. It is a completely different kettle of fish, so to say. And therefore, we have been, I would say, more on track to all our forecasts because of this very careful analysis of the pandemic and then the implications of the economy, rather than having a predetermined frame coming from comparison with the global financial crisis. That said, let me come to the forecast for FY22, which was made about roughly a year ago. We were the first and quoted, I think, in Economic Times, your network only. I predicted a double-digit growth, which was, I think, first reported in Economic Times. And since then, of course, we have done quarterly reviews as the data came in, but we have stuck to this forecast, which is 10%. Originally, it was 10% plus minus 1%, because I believe I've been in the business of forecasting for several decades, and you never have a point forecast because you must reflect the risk. There is no certainty in macroeconomics. So we started off with a plus minus. More recently, before the Omicron virus, we had reduced the range, but the Omicron started in November, December, and we have again increased that range to plus minus 1%, with obviously a downward bias because of the third wave.
Sure. I want to talk specifically about the impact that the pandemic has had on India's small businesses, data which I'm sure you're very well aware of. This is more for the benefit of our viewers. Studies showing that nearly 95% firms impacted negatively during the first lockdown in 2020. 70% businesses saw some sort of disruption till mid and late of 2020. Even with progressive unlocking reports showing that nearly 40% of businesses as of the mid of last year continued seeing disruption in their business and huge levels of uncertainty. Given the third wave, what do you think is perhaps going to be the impact that we're likely to see on India's small businesses? One, and the second part of the question, can we afford to have another lockdown? And then what perhaps is going to be the solution in ensuring that the debate between lives and livelihoods that is really being maintained?
Answer to the last question is very simple. It is no. So let me explain.
Okay.
The first wave, as I said, we had predicted that by the fourth quarter of the last year, which was FY21, it would be over. And as soon as the second wave started, we did a cross-state study covering, I think it was about 15 to 20 states, where we actually looked at the propagation, and we came to two conclusions. This was well before the medical evidence had come in.
Sure.
That this Delta virus, at that point it was not called Delta, it came to be called that much later, but that it was highly transmissible. We could conclude that from the propagation of the data in the states. And we actually calculated a percentage which turned out to be quite close to the one determined medically later on. And the main point there, which is why I'm repeating it, is that we said that the wave would rise much more rapidly than the first wave and also decline much more rapidly. That's the key issue. And that has implication from the Omicron. The Omicron is also much more transmissible, even than the Delta. So the same thing is going to happen. It's going to rise even more rapidly. Spread, rise means spread, and then it's going to decline even more rapidly than the Delta.
Sure.
So that is first thing which has economic implication. You can see there will be a sharp knock, but then the adjustment will be much faster if we are prepared for the whole thing. So that's one simple implication which comes from studying the nature of these pandemics. Given that the lockdown is clearly, we had said even, I think half after June, by June, we had been recommending a quick removal of the lockdown, June of last year, year before last now. So clearly lockdown is not the solution. So what do our studies show? What we showed was that there are basically three, in the situation, it's best to think of three different aggregate sectors. One is, of course, essential commodities, which is your agricultural sector, which was not affected by the lockdown. The second is what we call contact services. Services where a lot of people come into contact, and therefore transmissibility can be high.
Sure.
And the third sectors were the usual manufacturing, mining, construction, etc. So what we had said was that the restrictions on the mining construction sector should be lifted very quickly. And this was actually not really understood well. And in fact, that is one of the sectors which has suffered the most. If we look at the employment data, particularly, which you mentioned in your introductions, is the manufacturing and construction sector. Surprisingly, when we think of informal sector and the contact services where there was a problem, there were both natural fears of people and the closures were more affected on the trade, for example, hospitality. Everybody knows about those. But it turns out, if you look at the actual employment data, which is now available till Q4 of last year, it actually shows that it was the regular wage employment, not the informal. Again, there is this perception which has been propagated by NGOs that somehow it's only the casual labor or the informal, the self-employed who have suffered the most, but there's no evidence of that. I mean, it may be true, but there is no data to support it at this point in time, except for some surveys, which I'm not sure about the quality, and also very focused on the lockdown period. In the lockdown period, actually, whoever had less wealth clearly suffered, because all of us, including myself, including probably you, had to depend on our accumulated savings to carry out much of the things. So lockdown was not the answer to the second wave. It's not the answer to the third wave.
I'm going to slip into a short break on that note, Dr. Virmani. We're back in just a moment. Welcome back. You're with us here on Leaders of Tomorrow, and our icon tonight, someone who needs absolutely no introduction, Dr. Arvind Virmani. So then, what really should be the support, if any, that you think that the government should be doing for India's small businesses? Tax concessions, handholding, SOPs. What should that really look like in your opinion?
It's important to remember that the length of the wave, this third wave, is going to be shorter. And therefore, I think we must remain that the amount of support which was required earlier, which again, our research has shown and which we had recommended early, right from July, August, at that time we wrote several papers, which was to have a targeted approach and make sure that firms survive, to rise again, so to say, to continue when it normalized. Sure. I think that is less critical now because people have learned to adjust. It's really now more important that we go back to the higher growth to take care of these accumulated problems, as I said, which remain carryover. For example, the regular employment being lower, the wage rates being somewhat lower in the less skilled categories, etc. So what the data shows us is that the consumption part, the private consumption is recovering more slowly. So most of my recommendations for the budget are really directed at that. So and they have to do with the long-term recovery of the economy and going back to a faster growth rate, going back to the trend growth rate of 7.5% or so. So what are these? Very simply, I won't elaborate, but first is the direct tax code, which has been pending to simplify the code because that is what affects the MSMEs the most. Corporate tax reform, as you know, has been already been carried out. So in some sense, the playing field has been tilted in favor of the corporates who got this benefit of a better, simpler corporate tax. So we need to do the direct tax code reform to put the MSMEs on the same playing field. Secondly is the GST. I favor, in my view, there's obsessive attention to short-term revenues. And what we need is a simpler tax system which is revenue negative in a way. So when you look at it today, I don't mind if it looks like we are going to lose revenues when we do this simplification, with the key element of which is 15% for 3/4 of the products. That will make life so much simpler for MSMEs. It will give a boost to private consumption. And finally, customs duty reform, again, the simplification to promote labor-intensive exports and joining supply chains. India has been out of the supply chain. So all these things taken together, these three sets of reforms are really going to give a huge incentive and a boost to MSMEs and also deal with the consumption problem and the fact that much of the employment loss during the pandemic has been, as I said, the regular employment. Sure. So these measures will put the economy on a faster growth path and solve these three problems which have arisen.
Sure. Since you were saying, faster growth, I do want to talk about the PLI scheme. The government did give a boost to the manufacturing sector through the PLI scheme. But MSMEs have for a while now been asking for a specific scheme which will allow them to participate meaningfully. From the last we understand, no such proposal is being considered by the government. What in your mind should be done to ensure that the benefits of the PLI are trickling down to India's small businesses as well?
I mean, we can't talk about the PLI scheme without talking about this allegation that government has become more protectionist. Well, it turns out there were 2 years, 2018 and 19, when the tariff rates actually increased. But the latest data from WTO shows that in 2020, much of that increase in average tariff rates has been reversed. Okay. So in fact, if you think of it as going to Atmanirbhar Bharat from Make in India, you could say that, okay, Make in India seemed to have some protectionist tendencies, but that has been corrected with the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme, and we are back to that. The PLI scheme really is a complement to a better customs duty, where I already indicated there is some reform which are still needed, customs duty structure. But the PLI scheme is really designed to close the gap in minimum efficient scale between India and China. You know, there are many elements of competitiveness, some of those being addressed, for example, infrastructure, etc., are being addressed,
Sure.
some faster, some slower. But the PLI scheme is designed to address a particular specific problem, that the scale of India's production is generally much lower than that in China. So the issue is not to be the same scale as China, but to meet the minimum efficient scale, after which the gains from higher scale are not really that much. So that is the objective of the PLI scheme. Now, I do believe the textile part of it will benefit the MSMEs. And if there are other labor intensive sectors where the PLI scheme has not been announced, certainly electronics is a sector, maybe things like shoes, plastic goods, and other labor intensive sectors where the MSMEs could more directly benefit. Perhaps those should also be considered if there is an issue of scale. So I emphasize again, the PLI scheme is very uh, targeted to increasing the scale. If there is no issue of scale, then I don't think the PLI scheme is appropriate for meeting that problem.
Several experts, including TV Narendra of CI, coming on ET Now, have argued for the fact that the government needs to urgently put in place a roadmap for the next 15 to 20 years to have a comprehensive manufacturing, not a policy, but to encourage manufacturing in the long run, because that's the only thing that's really going to have any meaningful impact as far as encouraging more domestic production is concerned. Would you have any thoughts on that? What should perhaps that blueprint or that roadmap look like in your mind?
We at EGROW Foundation, which was one of the reasons I mentioned it in the beginning, we have about 3 to 4 months ago, we've done a paper titled Vision 2050. So actually, that requires a whole a discussion on itself, but I can give you a few indicators, which actually has a roadmap, 15-year and 30-year vision. You know, it's not a roadmap, it's not a planned document, it's a vision of how I see India's role in the world, what are the competitiveness issues. To give you one example, you had also mentioned skills. So what I envision in that is looking at the international evolution of population and labor forces across the world. What I envision is that India's competitive advantage will shift from labor intensive goods in the next 5 years to semi-skilled labor intensive to skilled labor intensive. Of course, India being a large country, we already have many multinationals having their R&D centers in India, but I'm talking about the country as a whole, right? So it's very important that we develop these skills, these job skills across the whole spectrum, because we will go through this process. We don't want to lose the current moment when countries and companies are trying to diversify out of their high risk operations in China because they are too monopolized in China. So that diversity we must capture in the next 5 years in form of labor intensive production, where MSMEs come in, where the reforms I mentioned come in, and
Sure.
then move to semi-skilled labor, for example, connected with health services, right? Nurses have been talked about for a long time. We still don't seem to have done much about it. So there are many areas of semi-skilled, like carpenters, many other things like that, which we call semi-skilled, and then of course the higher skill level, the future, artificial intelligence, etc. So across this whole range of skills, we need to do much more on that. I think we've talked about it for 10, 15 years, but we are lagging in the actual implementation. So that is one. Just very quickly, I think the digital economy is going to play a critical role, not just in generating jobs, but in improving the quality of education and health services. And surprisingly, in equality, in gender equality and caste equality. We can discuss that if we have time. And finally, of course, the green economy is going to be a big thing over these next 15 to 30 years. So these are the three key elements in that vision.
I have a couple of questions out of what you've said. I'll come back to those, but I just very quickly want to talk about the services sector. Earlier, you spoke about, contact services, services industries, including, travel, tourism, hospitality, all of those which had started seeing an uptick towards the middle of last year, towards the end of last year, have again started facing, the worst really as far as consumer demand and sentiment, of course, thanks to this third wave. For any sort of long-term meaningful support to come into these services and industries, what can be done? Technology, for instance, that you were just talking about, how can perhaps more technology be harnessed in some of these industries for this, to ensure that going forward, any long-term impact perhaps gets absorbed?
So I think the productivity in the service sectors, which include fintech and all the other modern services, there's a whole bunch of telecommunication, financial, and what I call modern services. I don't know what other people refer, and kind of the traditional services. So clearly in the modern services, the digital economy is clearly connected with that whole digital element which I mentioned, which everybody is now talking about. But the key there, in my view, is going to be this work from anywhere, work from home, one issue, which will help in the equality which we all seek, whether it's gender equality or caste equality, etc. Again, we don't have time probably to go into the details, but the second element I want to emphasize is, and this is something I wrote in a planning commission paper 15 years ago, that the only way to bring Indian education and health, there are too many people. I mean, just to give a simple example to connect with the common person, I visited, one of the prominent new hospitals in Delhi after a period of 10 years. In the first time I visited, it was spotless. It was like instant service. 10 years later, it was like a railway platform. Okay, there's just no way we can create enough physical infrastructure of the highest quality for everybody in this country. What we can do is we can supply up to 75 or 80% of what is needed in education and in health at the highest quality through the digital network. So that is going to be a key thing in achieving high income status for India. So these are the two things I would emphasize, and these are all connected to services.
That's all we could put into tonight's show. If you have any feedback for us, do let us know. Our contact details on your screens as we speak. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.